Okay, so today we're pulling back the curtain on a situation that's, well, it's a lot more complex than you might think just reading the headlines. Picture this. A luxury hotel in Panama City. You know, the kind with sea views, nice restaurants, pool, spa, that whole deal.
Right, the five-star experience.
Exactly. Now imagine that same hotel being used as a temporary detention center for nearly 300 undocumented migrants deported there by the U.S.
Wow.
Yeah. And from the street, people saw a handwritten sign saying, "Please help us." Someone hung out a Los Angeles Lakers jersey. And there was even a sign that read, "Please save the Afghan girls."
That's incredibly stark.
It is. And security is super tight. We've seen reports saying migrants were denied lawyers, even had their internet cut off. So this image, this hotel situation, it just immediately throws up so many questions,
Yeah.
about the bigger picture of U.S. deportations.
Absolutely. It's clearly not just about borders.
Right. It's people, it's policy, international relations. It's all tangled up. So our mission today is really to get beyond those headlines. We want to give you a thorough understanding of who's being deported, how it happens, why, and what the effects are, both here and, abroad.
And we've got a fair bit of material to draw on news reports, research, some firsthand accounts, too.
Yeah, we'll unpack some, frankly, surprising details and try to connect the dots. Because it can feel like a huge amount of information otherwise.
And I think what becomes clear pretty quickly when you look at Panama, or say the situation with returns to Haiti, is how these immediate, often really desperate situations on the ground connect directly to much bigger geopolitical things. Economic pressures, too.
Yeah.
It really makes you ask, how much leverage do these countries receiving deportees actually have when the U.S. makes these kinds of demands?
That's a huge question, and the Panama example really highlights it. We're talking about 299 people from, well, all over. India, China, Uzbekistan, Iran, Vietnam, Turkey, Nepal, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka.
A really diverse group.
Incredibly diverse. And those messages, like the Save the Afghan Girls sign that children were reportedly holding, it just drives home the human side of this, the distress.
Yeah, definitely.
We saw testimony from an Iranian woman. She'd been in touch with someone inside, said they were just terrified of going back to Iran, denied lawyers, couldn't leave their rooms.
And the security got tighter after the story broke.
That's the report. Tighter security, internet cut completely. Now, the Panamanian government calls it temporary custody. For their protection, they say.
Okay.
They claim 171 agreed to go home. The others, they're facing transfer to a camp in Darien.
The Darien Gap. That's not an easy place. Infamous jungle crossing.
Exactly. And interestingly, Panama agreed to be this bridge country, for U.S. deportations after Secretary of State Marco Rubio visited.
Ah, okay.
And this was happening amid some background tension, too, right? Over former President Trump's threats about recovering sovereignty of the Panama Canal.
So it really shows how individual lives get caught up in these big, high-stakes international games.
Absolutely.
And like you said, Panama isn't unique here. Look at Haiti. The U.S. resumed deportation flights there in April 2024.
Despite the situation on the ground.
Exactly. Despite, widespread extreme violence. It's so bad that the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the UN High Commissioner for Refugees both urged the U.S. to stop forced returns.
But the flights continued.
They did. And critics, like Eric Crew from the Haitian Bridge Alliance, they argue this violates non-refoulement. That's the core idea. You can't send someone back to face serious harm.
Right.
And they also argue it disproportionately targets Black migrants.
And the methods used for deportation, the logistics, they can cause diplomatic friction too, right?
Oh, absolutely. The Trump administration, for instance, used U.S. military planes for deportations to Guatemala, among other places.
Which probably didn't sit well in Latin America.
No, not given the history of U.S. military intervention there. It raised a lot of concerns. And then you had that spat with Colombia in January 2025.
What happened there?
President Gustavo Petro just refused entry for 2 U.S. military planes carrying Colombian deportees. He demanded they be treated with decency.
Based on what?
He cited reports about Brazilian migrants being handcuffed, held on planes without air conditioning during their removal.
Yeah.
Really alarming stuff.
Wow. How does the U.S. respond?
Well, Trump threatened tariffs on Colombian goods. Visa restrictions, too.
So escalation.
Big time. Petro fired back, threatening counter tariffs, and you see the ripple effects. Venezuela, for example, initially agreed to take deportees back.
Okay.
But then President Maduro said the U.S. revoking Chevron's oil license created a little problem, as he
A
put
little
it.
problem, right.
So what happened next? The U.S. deported 238 Venezuelans, but not to Venezuela. They sent them to El Salvador, to the Sicat prison, which is notoriously harsh.
On what grounds?
The U.S. alleged they were members of the Tren de Aragua gang, a major transnational criminal group known for being really brutal.
So it's this complex mix of diplomacy, economics, security claims, and, well, human lives caught in the middle.
Precisely. And it keeps going. China, for instance, says it'll only take back people from mainland China. No Hong Kong, Macau, or Taiwan. And Honduras pushed back quite hard. President Xiomara Castro threatened to shut down a U.S. military base, rethink cooperation policies.
And wasn't there something about U.S. aid being cut around that time?
Yeah, the U.S. suspended foreign aid to many countries, though Israel and Egypt were exceptions. And Honduras had also switched diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China back in March 2023.
So many moving parts. It paints a really dynamic, often quite tense global picture. It's
Yeah.
easy to kind of gloss over the day-to-day mechanics of all this, isn't it? But when you actually dig into how these deportations work, well, some surprising things come up.
The operational side, yeah, it's quite something.
So IC Immigration and Customs Enforcement, they have this division called IC Air Operations, or IAO. That's their main air transport wing. They manage transfers, removals, using regular commercial flights sometimes,
Yeah.
and also chartered planes. And before anyone boards, there's a process. Guards search detainees, checking mounts, pockets, under socks for contraband. Handcuffs go on. And the flights follow federal safety rules, just like any flight.
Standard procedure for transport, it sounds like.
Yeah, but here's where it gets. Well, unsettling. Really unsettling. Imagine you're on a charter flight, maybe you're heading to a big game, maybe a concert tour, and you realize that the exact same plane you're sitting on was just used, maybe days before, to transport shackled migrants. It just gets reconfigured.
Wow. That's quite a contrast.
It really is. It highlights this hidden, kind of uncomfortable side of air travel. Our sources talk about this shadowy network of private charter companies that IC contracts with.
Right, good.
Names like Classic Air Charters, Swifty Aero, World Atlantic Airways, Omni Air International.
Okay.
And the really disturbing part is the overlap. These same companies, often the very same aircraft that fly shackled migrants, also provide luxury charters for pro sports teams, NFL, MLB, NHL, NBA, college teams too, touring musicians.
So the same plane could be carrying, say, an NBA team one day and deportees the next.
Exactly. Take Omni Air. They advertise their Omni class, lie flat seats, entertainment systems, the works.
Luxury.
Right. But one of their planes, tail number N378AX, was documented flying deportees to Honduras. Same plane.
That's Pacific.
Yeah. And Aira Swift. They launched an ultra-luxurious service. Their first flight was for the Houston Rockets. They're also heavily involved in deportation flights.
Any other examples?
Yep. Plane N418US flew 2 deportation flights Honduras, Guatemala in 1 week. Then it flew the Wisconsin cross-country team.
Wow.
Another one, N531AU, was used for a flight to Guatemala where, tragically, families were separated. That same plane later flew USC basketball, LSU basketball, and the DC United soccer team.
That dual use. It really forces you to think about the ethics, doesn't it? These interconnected industries, the hidden logistics.
It really does. And unfortunately, the conditions on these flights and in detention in general, they can be pretty grim.
How so?
Well, there are reports of migrants being, quote, beaten or brutalized during the flights. And our sources detail the use of something called the wrap. It's a full-body restraint device.
Okay.
It's marketed as, like, a safer alternative to hog tying. But ICEA apparently uses it in ways that, quote, defy manufacturer recommendations.
In what way?
Holding people at really severe angles, 30 to 40 degrees, it constricts breathing badly, and it's used on top of existing shackles, which can cause nerve damage.
That sounds dangerous.
Extremely.
Yeah.
One survivor described being rolled into a bag, totally immobilized for about 9 hours, and then just left on the tarmac as a warning to others on the plane.
My goodness.
This person later got infected sores from the cuffs, was jailed back home, and said, heartbreakingly, "I cannot remember what it is like to feel safe."
That just raises a fundamental question, doesn't it? About the line between detention, which is administrative, and actual punishment. Especially for people who haven't committed crimes in the usual sense. The experiences you're describing, especially using restraints like the wrap that way.
Yeah.
It really forces us to look at the human rights implications.
And beyond the physical, there's the psychological toll, like deliberate family separation under the zero tolerance policy.
Right. That was infamous.
We found the case of Elsa Ortiz, a Guatemalan mother, deported without her 8-year-old son, Anthony. She was apparently so distressed on arrival they had to tranquilize her.
Horrific.
And another case, ELA, an indigenous man. He was told he was going to be reunited with his son, but instead they put him on a deportation flight straight back to Guatemala. Just cruel deception.
Yeah.
The personal stories are just harrowing. We read Jasmine Mooney's account. She's Canadian.
Yeah.
Detained for 2 weeks. They told her, you are not in trouble, you are not a criminal.
Okay.
Then suddenly she's shackled. Shoelaces taken away, held in a freezing cell. No explanation. Very limited phone calls.
Just like that.
Just like that. And her transfer. A 24-hour nightmare on a prison bus crammed with 50 people, chains on wrists, waist, feet.
Yeah.
She described the holding room as ice cold, no pillows, having to share a cup and spoon, people getting sick, ill-fitting uniforms, and fluorescent lights on 247.
It sounds like a complete stripping away of basic dignity.
Exactly, a total deprivation.
And maybe surprisingly to some, underpinning a lot of this, the actual operations, is what you could call the business of detention.
Right, the private prison companies.
Exactly. Companies like CoreCivic GEO Group, they operate the majority of immigration detention centers in the U.S.
And they make money from it.
A lot of money.
Yeah.
In 2024, CoreCivic made over $560 million from ICE contracts.
Yeah.
GEO Group, over $763 million.
Staggering figures.
And think about the incentive structure. It's pretty straightforward and pretty troubling.
Mm-hmm.
The more people detained, the more money these companies make.
So there's no incentive for them to release people quickly.
Right. Quite the opposite. And reports suggest they actively lobby for stricter immigration policies.
Yeah.
Policies that keep detention beds full. It creates this cycle where profit is tied directly to keeping people locked up. If we connect all this back, the legal arguments, the way these operations work, it's also deeply rooted in this long, often really contentious history.
Yeah.
Which makes you ask, right, how did those historical precedents shape the system we have now? Especially around things like due process, civil liberties.
That's a really good point. To get the full picture, we need to look at the legal side. Now, federal law does classify illegal entry as a crime.
Right, 8 U.S.C. 1325.
But there's this unique legal idea called the plenary power doctrine,
Yes.
which basically gives the federal government almost absolute authority over immigration. And the Supreme Court has generally said deportation is a civil administrative thing, not criminal punishment.
But that distinction, it's faced a lot of criticism over the years, even from judges. Judge Learned Hand famously called deportation exile a dreadful punishment. And Justice William O. Douglas said, banishment is punishment in the practical sense. It feels like punishment, even if legally it's classified differently.
And there are real due process concerns, right? Like deportations happening while legal cases are still ongoing.
Huge concerns. Our sources, including ICE's own records, show that between 2010 and 2020, almost 11,000 people, 10,923 to be exact, were deported on ICE air flights while they still had appeals pending.
So their legal fight wasn't even over.
Exactly. And it got to the point where a judge in Boston ruled that migrants have to be given a meaningful opportunity to object before being sent to a third country.
Why that specific ruling?
It came after reports that people were being sent to places like South Sudan, people originally from Myanmar, Vietnam, Cuba, Laos, Mexico, even South Sudan itself, with almost no warning.
Wow, okay. And this ties into that international law principle you mentioned earlier, non-refoulement.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That's a cornerstone of international human rights law. The basic idea is you cannot send someone back to a country where they face a real risk of torture, cruel or inhuman treatment, or other irreparable harm.
And it's in major agreements.
Yes, the 1951 Refugee Convention, the Convention Against Torture, it's even reflected in U.S. law itself in the Refugee Act of 1980.
But despite that,
yeah, there are serious concerns about it being violated. Amnesty International, for example, demanded the U.S. stop deporting people to Mauritania because of concerns about slavery there.
slavery's still an issue there.
Apparently so, yes. And Human Rights Watch found really disturbing things in Cameroon. Returnees subjected to imprisonment, torture, including rape retaliation against their families. Some were even killed by government forces.
That's horrifying.
It is. And think about Honduras and El Salvador. Extremely high levels of gang violence. LGBTQ+ migrants are especially vulnerable. Human Rights Watch found at least 138 Salvadorans who were deported from the U.S. were later killed back home. Many others face sexual violence, torture.
So sending people back there is potentially sending them to their deaths.
It raises profound questions about upholding those non-refoulement obligations. These aren't just numbers. It's a failure to protect people from very real harm.
And there's another concept that comes up here, double punishment. What's that about?
Right. This mainly affects former refugees, say from places like Cambodia or Somalia. People who came here legally, became permanent residents, built lives. But then, maybe decades later, they have a criminal conviction. And because of that conviction, they face deportation. Unlike a U.S. citizen who serves their time and that's it, these permanent residents face removal after serving their sentence.
So they're punished twice for the same crime, essentially.
Exactly. Once by the criminal justice system and again by the immigration system through deportation, despite having already paid their debt to society according to the law.
So how did we even get here? What are the historical roots of this system?
Oh, it goes way back. You can trace the ideas back to English colonial times, these warning out practices where communities would just kick people out. Then in the 1750s, you had the forced expulsion of thousands of Acadians. The first actual federal law allowing expulsion was the Alien Friends Act of 1798.
Okay.
But the real turning point, the moment it became a truly centralized federal system, was the Immigration Act of 1891.
What did that do?
It massively expanded the categories of people who could be deported. And crucially, it shielded immigration officials' decisions from judicial review, making it much harder to challenge deportations in court. That set a huge precedent.
And you mentioned voluntary departure earlier.
Right. That became a massive tool. Sounds voluntary, but sources say it was often coercive. People pressured into signing away their rights to a hearing.
Why was it used so much?
Because it was quick and cheap. No need for formal hearings. It accounted for something like 85% of all expulsions between 1920 and 2018. An enormous number.
And then there was Operation Wetback.
Yeah, 1954, a huge military-style operation targeting Mexicans for apprehension and expulsion. Conditions were often brutal, people packed into trucks, reports of abuse, a really dark chapter.
So when did deportations really ramp up to the levels we see today?
The age of mass expulsion, as some historians call it, really starts around 1965. This was driven by the big Immigration and Nationality Act that year, plus the end of the Bracero program, which had allowed temporary Mexican farm labor.
So fewer legal pathways, more unauthorized migration.
Exactly. And that led to a massive increase in expulsions, around 13 million between 1965 and 1985, mostly those voluntary departures.
And did the laws change too?
Big time. Especially in the 80s and 90s. You got a real shift towards militarizing the border and criminalizing immigration status.
Key laws.
The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, IRCA. And then the big one, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, often called IR-IRADU.
It dramatically broadened the list of deportable offenses, creating this vague category of aggravated felony that could apply to relatively minor crimes. It expanded expedited removal, allowing quick deportations without court hearings near the border. And it severely limited the power of courts to review deportation orders. So fewer checks and balances.
Much fewer. And then after 9/11, you get the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, merging immigration enforcement with national security concerns, blurring those lines even further.
And this system relies on cooperation with local police, too.
Historically, yes, relying on local police, even hospitals and charities sometimes. Yeah. But that cooperation became much more formalized with programs like Secure Communities and the 287G agreements, which deputize local officers to enforce federal immigration law. It creates this vast web.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. What does all this cost? Not just the human cost, which is immense, but the financial cost to the U.S.
Yeah. Well, beyond the undeniable human toll, the financial numbers are, frankly, pretty staggering.
Like what?
Our sources estimate that deporting just 1 million people per year over a decade would cost about $88 billion annually.
$88 billion a year?
Yes, totaling almost $968 billion over 10 years. And think about the infrastructure needed for that. You'd need 24 times the current ICE detention capacity, over 1,000 new immigration courtrooms. The scale is enormous.
Wow. How does $88 billion a year compare to other government spending?
It's huge. It's nearly twice the entire budget for the National Institutes of Health, all our medical research. It's 4 times NASA's budget, or 3 times what the federal government spends on child nutrition programs.
So we're talking massive amounts of taxpayer money.
Absolutely. Redirected towards detention and removal on a scale that rivals major federal agencies. And the economic impact beyond the direct costs. Also projected to be huge.
In what way?
A potential reduction in U.S. GDP, the size of our economy, at between 4.2% and 6.8%. That's a loss of $1.1 to $1.7 trillion.
Trillion.
Trillion. comparable in scale to the economic hit from the Great Recession.
That's hard to comprehend. What about the workforce?
Massive labor shortages predicted in key industries. Undocumented immigrants make up, 14% of construction workers, 1 in 8 farm workers, 1 in 14 hospitality workers.
All sectors rely heavily on this labor.
Definitely. Some specific trades, like plasterers, roofers, painters, they could lose over 30% of their workforce. And it's not just labor. There are about 1 million undocumented entrepreneurs. They generated over $27 billion in business income in 2022 alone.
Billion, with a B.
Yep. And there's this common idea, you hear it a lot, that mass deportation would raise wages for U.S.-born workers.
Right, the idea that they compete for the same jobs.
But the research doesn't really bear that out. Studies looking at the Great Depression, when many Mexicans were expelled, or the end of the Bracero program, or the effects of secure communities, they actually suggest the opposite.
What?
They found that employment and wages often decreased for U.S.-born workers in areas with mass removals. One economist summed it up. The economy is not a zero-sum game. It's more complex than just taking one group out means another group automatically benefits.
That's counterintuitive.
It is. And then there are the tax contributions. Undocumented immigrant households paid an estimated $46.8 billion in federal taxes in 2022, another $29.3 billion in state and local taxes.
So they are paying taxes.
Significant amounts. Plus, $22.6 billion contributed to Social Security, $5.7 billion to Medicare. It highlights this deep economic interconnectedness that often gets overlooked.
And beyond the economy, the social fabric. The impact on families must be immense.
Profound. You're talking about 4 million mixed-status families potentially affected. That includes 8.5 million U.S. citizens.
Wow, 8.5 million citizens impacted.
Yes, and 5.1 million of those are children, U.S. citizen children. When a family member is deported, the average household income plummets by nearly 63%. That's over $51,000 a year, gone.
That's devastating for a family.
Absolutely. And it's not just renters affected. 1.6 million homeowners could be impacted by mass deportation, losing their homes, facing foreclosure.
What's fascinating here, or maybe deeply concerning, is how all these consequences just ripple outwards. It's not just the person deported, right? It's the family, the community, the economy here.
Exactly.
And then impacts in the countries they're sent back to. It really makes you question those hidden costs, these complex links we don't always talk about.
Right. In the U.S., these policies, this enforcement climate, it creates what researchers call a climate of social control. Deep fear in communities. It makes migrants more vulnerable to exploitation because they're afraid to speak out.
Less likely to report crimes, maybe?
Definitely. Reduces crime reporting, leads to this pervasive distrust of law enforcement, even for things unrelated to immigration. And in the receiving countries, it's complex. Sometimes it exacerbates existing problems.
Like gang violence.
Yes, the growth of gangs like MS-13 in Central America has been linked in part to deportees from the U.S. bringing gang affiliations back with them. But conversely, you also see some deportees, often those with English skills, getting recruited by transnational corporations.
For things like call centers.
Exactly. Call centers in places like Guatemala, the Dominican Republic. It shows this really complex, evolving dynamic on both ends.
Okay, before we wrap up, there's one more thing we should probably address. It touches on that idea of fear and, well, misinformation.
Oh, yeah.
This brings us to an important point about how information and misinformation can spread, and how historical fears can latch on to current events. It really underlines why we need to dig into sources and get the full picture.
What are we talking about specifically?
Well, recently, these claims have been spreading online, especially on TikTok, claims that the U.S. is throwing deportees off planes into the ocean, with stories of shackled bodies washing up in Spain.
Right. I've seen those. It's crucial we address this directly.
Absolutely. So what's the reality?
The reality is there is zero evidence to support these claims linking bodies washing ashore in Spain to U.S. deportation flights. Zero.
So where are those stories coming from? The bodies washing up?
Police in Mallorca, Spain, they suspect the bodies. And yes, some were tragically found handcuffed are migrants, likely from Algeria. They believe they were victims of human traffickers, possibly killed during confrontations on smuggling boats crossing the Mediterranean.
So a terrible tragedy, but completely unrelated to U.S. deportation operations.
Correct. Deeply disturbing images, but not connected to IC Air or U.S. flights.
Okay. But the claim itself, throwing people from planes, it does have this really eerie historical parallel, doesn't it?
It does, unfortunately. It echoes Argentina's death flights during the military dictatorship there from 1976 to 1983.
Remind us what that was.
Thousands of political dissidents were drugged, put on planes, and thrown out alive into the Atlantic Ocean or the Rio de la Plata. A truly horrific, state-sponsored atrocity.
So while that did happen historically.
Yes, that horrific event is historical fact. But, and this is the crucial point, there is absolutely no evidence, none whatsoever, that the U.S. is doing anything remotely similar now.
Right. It's important to make that distinction crystal clear. The comparison shows how historical trauma can be exploited or resurface in these contemporary, often false narratives.
Exactly.
Well, this has been quite a deep dive. We've really seen the complexity of the U.S. deportation system, from those, frankly, unsettling overlaps with things like pro-sports travel.
Yeah, that was surprising.
To the truly staggering human costs, the economic impacts. It's clear this is a system with really deep historical roots, constantly evolving methods, and impacts that stretch incredibly far, hitting individuals, families, whole nations.
It's definitely not a simple issue. So many layers.
We really hope this discussion has given you, our listeners, a sense of those multiple layers, maybe encouraged you to look beyond the sort of simple narratives you often hear about migration and enforcement.
Yeah, to consider all the different angles.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with, something to mull over. Consider how the sheer profitability we talked about for the detention companies, the transport companies, how might that financial incentive actually influence policy decisions? And what does that mean when people call for reform? What other questions does all this raise for you about accountability, about basic humanity within such a vast and powerful system?